Good evening, all. It's such an extraordinary pleasure to be here. I have to say, I have never been to an event quite like this one. And I am so grateful to Laura and others at Circus of Life who chose to think of me and to invite me here. So thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for coming. So as was mentioned, I'm a co-host and also a producer at Democracy Now! In New York City. When thinking of our work, I'm recalled often to the writing of an Italian philosopher and political theorist, Giorgio Agamben, whom I've read for many years. In a beautiful text titled Nudities, he interprets a poem by the Soviet-Russian poet Osip Mandelstam, who died in 1938 in a gulag during Stalin's purges. The poem is called The Century, and in Russian, the word also means age or epoch. In his interpretation of the poem, Agamben writes of what it means to see one's own age. Quote, "The contemporary is he who firmly holds his gaze on his own time so as to perceive not its light, but rather its darkness." How is one then to perceive the darkness in the age that is ours? What distinguishes Democracy Now! Is its attempt to decipher precisely this darkness, to make it plain for all to see, even or especially those for whom only the light is visible. We do this in part by providing a platform for voices that are otherwise silenced in the media, though it may be more accurate to say the voices are not so much silenced as they are ignored, disregarded, condemned, or simply considered peripheral to the world as it is, the world as it must continue to be, according to those wielding the power to determine its shape. These voices very much exist. These voices cry out. And Democracy Now! Is dedicated to allowing those cries to be heard, cries that are and can only be painful and even unbearable to hear. How is one to listen to a father in Gaza telling us his son has just been killed in an Israeli airstrike, or an aid worker describing extreme malnutrition among children in Sudan, many of whom will not survive, or an American mother on the verge of tears as she speaks of the brutal police violence to which her daughter was subject? How is one to respond? But it is to these voices, these stories, that we must submit, not only for their intrinsic worth, but also as a corrective to the propensity in the media to speak only of what is commonly regarded as worth hearing and worth seeing. We are attentive here to the lessons of the 1960s French social theorist Guy Debord, whose words were virtually prophetic. His was one of the most acute observations of the violence produced by the present domination of mass media. Debord condemned what he termed the society of the spectacle, arguing that it works principally as a means of justifying the conditions of the dominant order. Our task at Democracy Now!, our task as participants in the making and consuming of images and information, our task is to work against such justification, and even more, to use the spectacle to serve the casualties of this order and not its beneficiaries. Parenthetically, and related to the spectacle, and this is a trivial point, but I think nevertheless symptomatic, many have commented over the years on the fact that I rarely, if ever, smile on the show, which of course is true. But this has always struck me as an odd observation, not because I don't like smiling or indeed even love laughing, but I simply fail to understand what it would mean to appear even slightly in good humor, if not positively complacent, when talking about dead children, war, starvation, poverty. What kind of gesture is a smile, and what kind of smile could accompany this speech without, in fact, appearing monstrous? In this spectacular society, when the line between news and entertainment has been almost entirely eviscerated, when the news is not only there to inform or even principally there to inform, why should one desire anything less than a pleasant expression, ideally accompanied by more, as they say, upbeat stories, even as the world offers more horrors than it is ever possible to represent? We are living irrefutably, if perhaps in some instances not irreversibly, in a time of multiplying and accelerating crises. To name only the most obvious and the most proximate, the slow and now rapid transformation of this country into a more brutal, more unforgiving, and more exclusionary polity and society, the scale of which, as we witness it, is literally unfathomable. The cruelty of the present administration is everywhere in evidence. To elaborate very schematically, the innumerable executive orders issued in the months since the current president took office, attacking arguably many of the foundations of what has redeemed this country for so many, and this is not to trivialize its past and ongoing violence and injustices. Executive orders including the systematic and quite deliberate onslaught targeting universities and education more broadly, the media, the law, regulatory agencies, birthright citizenship, foreign humanitarian aid, public health, affordable drug pricing, environmental regulations, refugee admissions, and international multilateral organizations, including withdrawing the US from the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Accords, which will naturally have implications all over the world. The president has not been successful in destroying many of these institutions fully, thanks in part to the vocal opposition by those in power who retain some commitment to their ideals, recognizing the comprehensive injustice he's inflicting, all in the service of concentrating more and more power in his own hands. The scale also of popular protests across the country has been unprecedented. Several million on No King's Day earlier this month, to take only the most recent example. And then too, there are the courts and the dedicated principled lawyers resisting the total ruin of the country in his hands. But the law also compromised, fractured, with the Supreme Court majority conservative, with the president systematically targeting lawmakers, restricting freedom of speech in all its forms, threatening those representatives of the law among whom he's unfavored. One can't help but wonder how long till things fall apart. In cases where he has been successful, or even partially so, in pushing through these measures, the effects are felt most of all, of course, by the most vulnerable in our society, the poor, the dispossessed, and most conspicuously, migrants, hundreds of thousands of whom have been deported since he came into office less than a year ago. But the effects are felt far beyond the borders of this country. And to mention only one, and the most obviously lethal, he has initiated the largest restructuring of US foreign assistance in history. the present administration has cut billions and billions of dollars of funding to US aid, the US Agency for International Development. And one should note here that the US is and has been for decades, in dollar amounts, not as a percentage of GDP, the largest aid donor in the world. The renowned and widely respected doctor and public health researcher Atul Gawande has pointed out, citing numerous scientific articles, that hundreds of thousands of people have perhaps already died as a result of these cuts. And if things remain unchanged, more than 10 million people could be at risk of death in the next 5 years. As conditions here, and not only here, become more repressive, as the relentless attacks on speech, on assembly, on opposition continue, the means available for people to resist will no doubt shrink. The Russian-American writer M. Gesson has provided perhaps the most instructive example of resistance under impossible conditions. They have spoken often of the choice their grandmother faced in the period immediately following the end of the Second World War in the Soviet Union. Their grandmother was trained as a history teacher, but decided she could not spend her life actively lying, telling children only what Stalin demanded be taught. So she decided instead to become a censor for the government, opening mail and discarding whatever material was impermissible. This work would have been done equally well, she thought, with equally bad effects, had she declined it. M. Gesson writes that this was far from a failing. In a situation where only two bad choices remain, the only moral act is to choose the one that causes the least harm, is the least injurious to the most vulnerable. To return to the litany of horrors to which we are witness, nothing is equal to the wars that have continued despite the president's claims, grandiose and narcissistic like all his claims, that he would end all conflicts in his first days in office. It remains to be seen what will become of the tentative Israel-Hamas ceasefire deal, a deal that appears sadly, if predictably, more tentative by the day. But whatever the deal is, minimally ensuring the return of Israeli hostages held in Gaza, the release of almost 2,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange, and the cessation of Israeli bombardment of the besieged territory, it is not a peace deal or even a means to achieving one. Nevertheless, it's no small matter that the bombardment has, at least for now, been more or less arrested, since the monumental and truly unconscionable scale of the massacre in Gaza has been and is beyond comprehension. There have now been innumerable reports and findings concluding that what has occurred in Gaza is a genocide, a conclusion reached by a huge range of bodies, including the International Association of Genocide Scholars, the United Nations, Amnesty International, and Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. Some of these institutions were born following the worst genocide in modern history, the extermination of the Jews in the Second World War. And these institutions, in particular the 1948 Genocide Convention, a treaty under the auspices of the UN, were tasked with the responsibility of ensuring no such catastrophe would occur again. But of course it has, from Cambodia to Rwanda and Srebrenica. But in the case of Gaza, as against the others, the countries that were responsible for setting up these institutions are the very ones most complicit in enabling it to continue. Indeed, it's difficult to name a state that is not complicit, if not outright criminal, in allowing the slaughter in Gaza to continue interminably. 2 years, over 70,000 dead, cities completely flattened, and most damningly, every moment live streamed to our screens. Who then can plead ignorance? The only gesture for people, the people, an abstraction, but not only one, is resistance. This is where the question of hope, too, arises. What kind of hope is possible? A hope not directed at the self, not necessitated by the desire to free oneself of fear or apprehension, not given over to sentimentality or an empty optimism. Here I'll turn to the words of the most recent recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Laszlo Krasznahorkai, who said in an interview earlier this year, "We can only delude ourselves with the future. Hope always belongs to the future, and the future never arrives. It is always just about to come." End quote. It is for this indeterminate future where hope belongs that one must act. One of the most hopeful acts, then, that came in the immediate aftermath of the ghastly Hamas attack, the horrific assault on Gaza that followed, was the mobilization of so many Jewish activists within days of Israel's war. Jewish activists who proclaimed loudly and unceasingly to this day, "Not in our name." These Jewish activists, within days of the October 7th massacre, within days of the slaughter in Gaza that immediately followed, these activists occupied Grand Central Station, hung banners from the Statue of Liberty, repeating, "Not in our name, ceasefire now." And all this, despite some having deep and abiding ties to people affected directly by October 7th, each inconsolable. And this is to say nothing of the terror that history afflicted, that, like all terrors, historic and contemporary, often, even against reason, prove immutable. And yet these activists cried out immediately, "Not in our name, ceasefire now." Of course, since then, there have been mobilizations across the country and across the world by Jews and Muslims and Palestinians, and the many allied with them, with so many protesting Israel's brutal war at great personal risk. Again here, these protesters, their heroism and commitment, have found vanishingly little representation in the media. But Democracy Now! Has been there, listening to these voices, allowing their cries to be heard, not just in the US, but all over the world, making clear that not everyone supports what successive governments in the US have enabled, that some people will not tolerate a massacre that is possible principally, if not indeed exclusively, because of the support of this country, that so many, even if not enough, that so many are insistent this carnage absolutely must not occur and absolutely cannot occur in their name. Making clear, too, that people here, people elsewhere, are not synonymous and do not identify with their states, that if they are so considered, it is only because Providence determined, against their will or without regard for their will, that they were born in a time and to a place capable of such blatant criminality. One could cynically claim, as some do, that ultimately these protests or their amplification had little or no effect. The violence continued and may still resume till the state most actively and purposefully enabling Israel decided it would no longer do so to the same extent without conditions. But the protests did something else. They provided some in Gaza with a sense, however fleeting, of not being entirely alone in their suffering. To take only one example, think of the people in Gaza, the children in Gaza, holding signs in the midst of the massive encampment at Columbia University, the signs reading, "Thank you, Columbia." Is a failed protest not still, then, a worthy one? And what, in fact, is the measure of success when hope lies in the future? To return to the spectacle, one of the most reflective and sober books to have been written about Gaza is by Umar al-Akkad, titled, and it's a beautiful title, "One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This." Among the many insights the book offers has to do with the media, which is worth quoting in full. Al-Akkad writes, quote, "It is a disorienting thing to keep a ledger of atrocity, to write the ugliness of each day as it happens. The months smother the months. Soon the years will smother the years. Killings that might once have made the front page news slowly submit to the law of diminishing returns. What is left to say but more dead, more dead? News is new, and whatever this is, it can no longer be called new," end quote. Democracy now aspires to be a corrective to this law of diminishing returns. What we seek are not returns, but a commitment to the inherent worth of every life, to the inherent worth of greater knowledge, greater understanding, a commitment crucially to telling the stories of people who have been lost among the dead, each death a singular one, not more and more of the same ones. It is for such telling, the telling of these unspeakable numbers, 70,000 deaths and many more remains buried under the rubble, these unbearable losses, naming all those complicit in this monstrous crime. It is for this reason alone that the media exists, or should exists, and this is what constitutes radical love. And finally, to end where I began, this time in the words of the German Jewish political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who writes, quote, "Even in the darkest of times, we have the right to expect some illumination, and that such illumination may well come from the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and their works will kindle under almost all circumstances," end quote. If there is hope, it is that in the moment and in an indeterminate future, there will be more such people and more means through which to tell their stories and the stories of those for whom they provided even the weakest light. Thank you.